2007, Nokia controlled almost half the world's phones. And then they made one decision they never recovered from. Not a scandal, not a fraud, not a war. A decision made in a boardroom by people who had already won and could not imagine losing. By 2013, Nokia's phone division was gone, sold to Microsoft for a fraction of what it was worth. $14 billion in market value, erased. Over 100,000 jobs, gone. This is not a story about technology. This is a story about what fear does to a company at the top of the world. Before we go any further, if you have never seen how a single wrong decision can erase a $100 billion empire, this channel will change how you see the world. Subscribe now, because what you are about to hear, they never taught you in school. To understand how Nokia fell, you have to understand how completely they dominated. In 1998, Nokia was the best-selling mobile phone brand on earth. Not one of the best, full stop. They had built something no other company had managed. A global supply chain, a manufacturing operation, and a brand that worked from Finland to Nigeria to South Korea. Their phones were durable, reliable, and everywhere. At their peak in 2000, Nokia's market capitalization was over $250 billion. They represented nearly 4% of Finland's entire gross domestic product. The Finnish economy was, in a very real sense, built around this one company. Their operating margins were extraordinary. Their engineering teams were world-class. They had more patents in mobile technology than almost any company alive. And then a 32-year-old named Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco, and Nokia's entire world changed without them realizing it. January 9th, 2007. Apple announces the iPhone. Nokia's internal response, documented by executives who were in the room, was dismissal. Their engineers pointed out the iPhone had no physical keyboard. They noted the battery life was poor. They calculated the price was too high for mass market adoption. They ran the numbers and concluded it was not a serious threat to their core business. Every one of those observations was technically correct, and every single one of them completely missed the point. The iPhone was not a better phone. It was a different object entirely. It was a computer that made calls. And Nokia, a company that had spent 15 years perfecting the phone, had no framework for thinking about what that meant. But here is the part the story usually skips. Nokia actually saw it coming. Inside Nokia's research labs in the early 2000s, engineers had already built touchscreen prototypes. They had concepts for app ecosystems. They had developers working on internet-connected devices years before the iPhone launched. One internal team had built a working touchscreen smartphone prototype in 2004, 3 years before Apple's announcement. The project was killed, not because the technology didn't work, because the executives who controlled the budget did not believe the market was ready, because launching it would have cannibalized their existing product lines, because the quarterly numbers were too good to risk disrupting. This is the central tragedy of Nokia. They did not fail because they were blind. They failed because they were afraid. And in a company that large, fear travels from the top down very fast. Here is how fear works inside a corporation worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Nokia's middle management knew the iPhone was an existential threat within months of its launch. Internal memos, later reviewed by researchers and journalists, show engineers and product leads raising alarms clearly and repeatedly through 2007 and 2008. But Nokia had a culture problem that made honesty dangerous. The company had grown so large, and the pressure to hit targets was so intense that delivering bad news to senior leadership had become a career risk. Managers who raised problems without solutions were seen as obstacles. Managers who projected confidence, even false confidence, were promoted. So the warnings were softened, the timelines were extended. The threat was consistently described as manageable. By the time the reality reached the top of the organization clearly enough to trigger real action, it was already too late to act decisively. Nokia's answer to the iPhone was Symbian. Symbian was Nokia's operating system, and it had been built for a world that no longer existed. It was designed for phones with physical buttons, limited memory, and no app ecosystem in mind. Updating it was slow. Building apps for it was painful. Developers hated it. Apple launched the App Store in 2008. Google launched Android the same year and gave it away for free to any manufacturer who wanted it. Nokia responded by doubling down on Symbian. They invested billions into a platform that developers were already abandoning. They launched phones that looked modern on the outside and ran on architecture that was falling further behind with every software update Apple shipped. They also had an internal project called MeeGo, a new operating system built from scratch, designed to compete directly with iOS and Android. It was promising. Engineers believed in it. It was canceled in 2011 after only one commercial device ever shipped. The reason? Nokia had just hired a new CEO, and he had a different plan. Stephen Elop arrived at Nokia in September 2010. He was the first non-Finnish CEO in the company's history. He came from Microsoft. In February 2011, he sent an internal memo to Nokia's staff that was leaked almost immediately to the press. He called it the Burning Platform Memo. He described Nokia as a man standing on an oil platform that was on fire. The man had two choices: stay on the platform and burn, or jump into the freezing water and swim. Elop argued that doing nothing was no longer an option. Nokia had to jump. The jump he chose was a full partnership with Microsoft. Nokia would abandon both Symbian and MeeGo and build exclusively on Windows Phone. The reaction inside Nokia was shock, not because the diagnosis was wrong. The burning platform analogy was accurate, but because the solution, abandoning their own operating systems entirely and becoming dependent on Microsoft, meant Nokia would never again control its own destiny. Windows Phone had less than 3% market share. It had almost no developer ecosystem, and Microsoft's track record in mobile was poor. Nokia had traded one burning platform for a sinking ship. The Windows Phone partnership failed publicly and completely. Developers did not come. Users did not switch. The phones Nokia built, the Lumia series, were genuinely well-designed devices that ran an operating system almost nobody wanted. Meanwhile, Samsung, running Android, was becoming the dominant force in smartphones globally. Apple owned the premium market. Nokia had no position in either. Market share collapsed. From 32% of the global smartphone market in 2011, Nokia fell to less than 4% by 2013. Revenues collapsed with it. The company that had earned billions in profit annually was now burning through cash reserves built up over decades of dominance. In September 2013, Microsoft announced it was acquiring Nokia's devices and services division for approximately $7.2 billion. The company that had been worth $250 billion sold its core business for $7 billion. Stephen Elop returned to Microsoft as part of the deal. Here is what the Nokia story costs. Beyond the numbers. 100,000 jobs eliminated across Nokia's global workforce between 2010 and 2014. Entire towns in Finland built around Nokia factories that closed. A national identity. Finland had been proud of Nokia in a way few countries are proud of a single company, quietly dismantled. The engineers who had built the touchscreen prototypes in 2004, the teams who had developed MeeGo, the product leads who had raised alarms in 2007 and 2008, all of them had seen it coming. None of them had been able to change what happened. Because the real disease inside Nokia was not a lack of innovation. It was a structure that protected the people at the top from the truth, until the truth became unavoidable. And by then, the only decision left was how much to sell for. Nokia did not lose to Apple because Apple was smarter. Nokia did not lose to Android because Google was more innovative. Nokia lost because it had built a machine designed to protect what it already had, and that machine worked perfectly, right up until the moment that everything it was protecting became worthless. The engineers were right, the middle managers were right, the warnings were accurate. But a company that punishes honesty and rewards confidence, even false confidence, will always make the same choice. It will choose comfort over survival. It will choose the quarterly number over the decade-long bet. It will choose the platform it knows over the one it needs to build. Nokia had 15 years at the top of the world. They had the engineers, the patents, the capital, and the warning signs. They had everything, except the willingness to be afraid out loud. Nokia sold their phone business in 2013. Microsoft wrote off $7.6 billion on the acquisition 2 years later, one of the largest write-offs in corporate history. The Lumia line was quietly discontinued. The Nokia name survived, licensed to other manufacturers. The company itself pivoted to telecommunications infrastructure where it still operates today. But the Nokia that dominated the world, the one on half the phones on Earth, is gone. And it did not go because the world changed too fast. It went because the people in charge of changing with it were too comfortable to move. So here is the question I want you to answer in the comments right now. Was Nokia's collapse inevitable? Or was there one decision, one moment where a different choice saves the company? Drop your answer below. Because the real lesson of Nokia is not about phones. It is about what happens to every empire that mistakes past success for future survival.